next chapter. And just as a reminder, everything from this point on is going to be for the final. So nothing from before. We're not going to do any cumulative stuff because I don't feel that's fair. So this on is going to be final stuff, and also as a reminder, we're Monday, Wednesday. So let's see. I'm already losing what day it is. Our paper is due in 2 weeks, so 24th of November is the final paper. Okay. So, let's try to get as much done as we can. So, immediately after the war, we've already got problems. So, we talked about the... Let me make sure that this is actually recording like it's supposed to, because I already had that issue before. Okay. We had the issue with the regular soldiers mutinying. Now we had the Continental officers who were angry about lack of pay because, you know, when you fight a war, you kind of want to get paid for it. The problem with this was a lot of these officers came from wealthy families and therefore had greater pull than the regular common soldiers, which also meant they weren't like hurting for money like the common soldiers were, but you know, when are the rich gonna actually be content with the amount of money they have? So Hamilton was sympathetic, wanted to have a duty of 5% on imported goods so the federal government actually could have some money and use this to pay its various debts, including to its own soldiers. Because again, the Articles of Confederation didn't really give the federal government any way to make money, and therefore the federal government couldn't pay people. Which was by design, but we'll get that in a minute. So the fact that Hamilton was on board with working with these guys at all, had the officers circulating petitions for what they wanted, that included veiled threats of using the fact that they were the military to just take over the government because they could. Yeah, there was no like government military to stop them. They just it was there because they let it be there. Thankfully, George Washington rolled in and had a chat with them in Newburgh, New York. Had them step back from their quote infamous position because guys, we just finished a war. Let's not have like a military coup right away. Now, when they did back off, Congress did promise them full pay for 5 years, which is certainly better than the regular troops got, which was half pay. So, hey, apparently if you're rich, you're just going to get treated better. What do you know? I couldn't find an actual image for this one, so I've just got Washington giving his farewell speech to his officers. So that's all I've got for images for that one. Other things happening immediately after the war. So 1784, which again is like a year after the war, 2 years after the war, U.S. land commissions wanted land concessions from the Iroquois, who were more or less the largest single tribe in at least this side of the Mississippi, but who had remained neutral throughout the last couple of wars because they'd seen what happened to nations that had been fighting on either side. So this treaty would have basically given up a ton of land to the U.S. And the Iroquois were like, hey, no, this is not good for us at all. This doesn't give us much of anything. So they refused to ratify the treaty, and the U.S. government just acted like they had ratified it anyway and took their land, which is what's going to happen well into next semester in terms of our material, because that's how the federal government likes to handle the natives. She's like, oh, here's this treaty that you guys signed. It's like, we've never seen this treaty. What are you talking about? Cool, get off our land or we'll shoot you. Or we might just like shoot you as you're leaving the land anyway, because, you know, U.S. Army. But it wasn't just the natives on the land that the U.S. government claimed. There were also squatters. There were also people who had like moved into the land prior to the people who, quote, owned it had come in. For example, in 1784, Washington had to deal with the squatters that were on his land. Let me get to fall of 1784, George Washington traveled with family members and slaves to survey nearly 30,000 acres of Western territory he had been granted as a reward for military service. First off, who the hell needs 30,000 acres of land? Like, especially in the 1780s, you're not even going to be able to use that much land. He found much of the land occupied by squatters who refused to purchase their homesteads or pay rent to Washington. Unable to impose his will on the squatters because they just wouldn't listen, he became more deeply concerned about the weakness of the Confederation government, which is what we're moving towards. So, Northwest Land Ordinance. This is what's going to use all this land east of the Mississippi, but west of the Appalachians. So again, drafted by Thomas Jefferson, because he's like our documents guy. It was meant to turn the Western Territories into 14 small states, because each state would get, I think with the Articles of Confederation, each state got one representative, and I think that was it. I think like each state got one representative. The population didn't matter. So if there was a bunch of small states, the farming states would get more power. But eventually they modified it so there was between 3 and 5 territories, and then once the population reached a certain number, which is say 60,000, they could apply to these states. So this is where we get like Indiana and Illinois and Ohio and all those states that nobody cares about because they're awful liminal spaces that shouldn't exist. Having been through them a couple of times now, they're weird. They're weird places. This also caused a little bit of an issue. Slavery was made illegal up here, but if slaves escaped into this region, they had to be recaptured and returned to where they had escaped from. So while technically this is considered the Northwest area, because again, the Mississippi is, beyond that is Spanish territory. If any natives escaped into, any slaves escaped into this region, while technically there was no slavery here, they still had to follow essentially slavery law and capture them and return them to, slave states here, which I guess Kentucky was as well. But yeah, so that was a whole thing. This mostly is showing, this particular map is mostly showing the various native tribes that lived in this region. And then obviously obviously we just got real creative with naming this one. It's well, we're just going to name it after the tribe we've kicked out. Clearly, we didn't use this name for this region, though. We supplanted it much further south. I already showed you guys this map last time, just with all the various territories that were claimed by these states over here, and then Maryland's like, well, we don't have any, so we're going to not sign the thing until you guys give this up to be parceled out into their own individual states. So, yeah, blah, blah, blah. Oh, yeah. Also, apparently, we've always been a war economy. When the war ended, the economy started to slump, which we didn't have much of an economy to begin with. I mean, as far as, like, in the war, I mean, that's what we talked about a lot during the war, was the fact that our economy was, like, on fire for most of it. And there was the issue of the massive war debt we had to France and also to Holland that we needed to pay back. So we needed to start making money to pay off our debts. Otherwise, they were just going to keep building. So the federal and state governments figured that the best way to make this money was to head west and to use the, quote, open unsettled lands to make this money. Because again, up until the Industrial Revolution, from as far back as we've had human civilization, the way to make money was land. You would use land for farming, or you would simply buy the land and rent it out to people for them to do the farming, and then whatever money they'd make, they'd use a portion of that to pay you rent. That's basically how money has been made for the last several thousand years. Manufacturing really wasn't much of a thing yet, and trade was off the back of stuff that was grown on farms typically. Manufacturing was starting to happen in, like, England. So the Industrial Revolution was happening, starting very early in England, but over here, barely. That said, we did have leaders like Hamilton who were pushing for other things. Import dues to get this money more quickly and to pay off these debts more quickly, because if you're getting, if you're taxing imports, because the import dues is the same as the tariff. If you're taxing imports, you're getting that as you're getting the imports, and then that's going into federal coffers, and that can be used for whatever the federal government needs. Hamilton was also so in that technology and history course that I taught upstate, it opens with like a Hamilton v. Jefferson thing, where Jefferson was all about doing agriculture, all about we should be an agricultural nation, and put all our time and energy and any technology that we have into just being this big agrarian society. Whereas Hamilton was like, hey, this whole like industrial thing starting over in Europe, if we want to keep up with them, we need to do manufacturing. So that was one of the many reasons they butted heads. We're going to see that a lot going forward. So Hamilton was going the other direction. We had states like Massachusetts passing laws that had required that debts be repaid in hard currency, so gold or silver, as opposed to paper money, which was better for the people who were offering the debts rather than merchants and farmers, because as I've said many times, the paper money lost value really quickly. But if you took out, let's say, a $50 loan, and then you pay back $50 of paper money, it might not be worth $50 in gold or silver, but it's still, hey, here's $50, whatever. Um, but 50 in gold or silver is still going to be worth 50 in gold or silver, more or less, for quite some time. I mean, gold and silver prices do fluctuate a little bit, but unless there's like a major like worldwide financial crisis, it's not going anywhere. And even when there is, like if you ever watch old people TV, they're like, buy gold because blah 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 blah. And they have like a graph that's showing like spikes and stuff. But if you ever actually look at the numbers, it's like 0.01% with these huge spikes because it's so the price of gold and silver changed so little over time because they're very stable, I guess. Um, Also, we weren't making friends worldwide. Needless to say, Britain wouldn't let us trade with their holdings in the West Indies because, I mean, we had just had a war. So they weren't exactly buddy-buddy with us. We also pissed off Spain, one of the countries that had, worked with us in the war, because American settlers were, like, encroaching on the Mississippi River and, like, crossing into Spanish territory. And so they closed off New Orleans to us for trade, which was a problem because that was like the main port, like at all on that side of the country. The closest port we had as far as our territory was like Charleston, because that whole Gulf Coast was pretty much Spanish because they had Florida back, so that was the whole Panhandle, and we didn't really have much down in Alabama or Mississippi yet. So yeah, that was not good for us. We also had British troops that were along the frontier that encouraged natives to give American settlers a hard time, which, to be fair, the American settlers there weren't exactly making friends with the natives, so the British were just stirring the pot. They didn't necessarily need to be there to make things worse, they just were. At the least, though, we had France and Holland that let us trade with their holdings in the West Indies. So we had a little bit happening in terms of like global commerce, but we weren't in a real good place. I do have this like Hamilton's economic plan. We'll get into like each of these later on. I mostly brought it up for the tariff that he was suggesting, but he gets into each of these specifically as we go along. And each of them are very important and also cause him a lot of issues. All right. Also, the whole separation of church and state thing was actually a response to like the British, um, because under British government, the Anglican Church is just an arm of the British government. It's just a part of the government. If you go to school in Britain, you learn all the catechisms and stuff of the Anglican Church just in school. But unlike, say, here in the States where you either go to public school, which is, at least right now, separate from religion, or you go to a private religious school where everything's religion and then there's some like school stuff underneath. There it's just like another subject. You've got math and science and literature and whatever, and then there's like, oh, and also this is the church that's part of the government, and that's just how it is, and um, this that's just it. It's just part of the normal learning in England, and at least back then you were required by law to go to church, but mostly because it was a tax thing, because your tithe that you paid to the church was basically a tax. The church collected taxes, and were supported by said taxes. But since we were no longer a part of England, we weren't part of the Anglican Church anymore. So obviously, like, that wasn't a thing anymore. Also, though, with the Statute of Religious Freedoms, which was also drafted by Thomas Jefferson, there was the issue of a couple of states. I think the main one was Connecticut, where they had like a large number of a certain religious group. I don't remember exactly which denomination it was, but where basically they were in charge of like the government of the state, and they were requiring that they had essentially taken over what the Anglicans were doing, and were requiring people to go to their church. And a couple of other denominations got together and like petitioned Jefferson. It's like, hey, this doesn't feel right. And so he put together the Statute of Religious Freedom, which essentially made attendance voluntary to any church. So, you can choose whatever church you want to go to or not, which ends up going into the first amendment to the Constitution, which we'll get to later. Now, that said, again, especially early on, if you were going to be an office holder in most states, you were basically required to be Christian. And honestly, even still today, it's hard for anybody that like isn't professing their religion to make it. We just had Mayor of New York as a Muslim, and like there was so much fear mongering over that, it was ridiculous. Yeah, so it's been 200 years. It doesn't feel like it. Well, 150 years, I guess now, 1780s. 200 years, 7, 8, 9. Anyway. Yeah. And typically Protestant, there's still this whole thing about, well, not today, but up until JFK, about like Catholics aren't really Protestant, or not really Christians, which is a whole separate thing. But you could at least be different denominations of Protestant. So the frontier, there was Baptists and Methodists, because those were more popular among like the poor people, and those were typically the ones that were out on the frontier. Quakers and Presbyterians also grew in number. And there was some degree of toleration for Catholics and Jews. They got to build a few churches without having them burned down, so that was nice. We'll get to that turning around later, maybe next semester, but yeah. Also, we have Richard Allen. Born a slave, gained his freedom, and led the first African-American church in America, in Philadelphia in 1794. This was the Bethel African-American Methodist Church, which remained part of the larger Methodist Church until, the early 1800s, and they tried to kick Allen out. They're like, we were being real tolerant there, but we just remembered we were real racist, so we're going to kick you out. And instead, Allen and his whole congregation just got up and left and made their own church. their own denomination. The first independent black denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is just what happens with Protestant denominations. If they have a disagreement and there's enough people on one side and the other, they just go their separate ways and make their own church, which is surprising that Richard Allen was able to do this in the early 1800s, but I mean, it was Pennsylvania, so, he had some rights. So that was pretty cool. So bill establishing religious freedom, et cetera, et cetera. So that's Jefferson's thing here. Then I've got Richard Allen. Guess this is out in front of the church that he founded. I'm assuming the African Methodist Episcopal Church was also in Philadelphia. I mean, I would imagine you'd stick around Pennsylvania at least. So, the revolution happened, which is all well and good. And some slave owners were like, hey, we fought for freedom, and that's great, and also the whole, using the Phrygian cap as a symbol thing. Some had the brain power to realize, oh, wait, we're fighting for freedom, but we have slaves. That's dumb. We shouldn't do that. Let's get rid of our slaves. So they free their slaves. Others free them in their wills. Washington. So, once they died, their slaves would be free, so they could still benefit from having slaves, but they could die with a clear conscience, knowing that once they're gone, their slaves can be free, and somebody else can deal with that. Yeah. So if you ever hear somebody say, well, Washington freed his slaves, it's like, yeah, when he died. Some states prohibited importation of slaves from Africa because, well, I mean, we're getting real close to that just being an impossibility anyway. But bringing more people over from across the ocean on a boat that's going to kill a lot of them, yeah, probably shouldn't do that. Still, though, by the time we got to 1800, there were more slaves in America than there were in 1776, simply due to the growing population. Because again, unlike in, say, Brazil, in the Caribbean, where they were routinely worked to death, a lot of the farms in the U.S. I guess a lot of is a proper phrase to use. Most of them didn't kill their slaves outright. Not that it was, fun summer camp or anything, but it typically didn't kill them so fast that they couldn't, have kids. Now, obviously, the northern states were either outlawing slavery entirely or passing gradual emancipation laws, like we saw with Pennsylvania. In the South, they actually made it harder for owners to free their slaves, which I always have to pause on. So, if you take slavery at its most base, inhumane value, just say, okay, well, these people are property. Let's just ignore all the morality of it just for a minute, and just be like, okay, these people are property. Let's just equate them to regular ass property for just a minute for this argument. The southern states are passing laws that made it harder for these farmers to get rid of their property? Like, what kind of individual freedom is this? Why do the states care what these people do with their property? And the reason is because they know if a lot of these slave owners start freeing their slaves, there's going to be a lot of free people roaming around in the South that are going to be displeased with the state of things. And they were terrified of that. So that's why. But, yeah. We had a number of free black communities that were sprouting up around seaport cities. We've mentioned this also in previous chapter. Well, not previous chapter, chapter before. Philadelphia, New York, Boston, New Bedford, Massachusetts. Again, port cities. We also mentioned in New Jersey, as long as you owned a certain amount of property, you could vote. Now, again, it wasn't written in the law that, hey, if you own property and you're black, you can vote. It's just, if you own property, you can vote. Just, that's it. So, technically, it meant that if you were black and owned property, you could vote. And also, in the next slide, if you were a woman and you owned property, you could vote. Those loopholes get closed later, but for a while, New Jersey was like this wild wasteland of, hey, if you own property, you can vote. That's cool. Pennsylvania did not specifically exclude black men from voting. It just said men in Pennsylvania can vote with these various factors. Although if the poll worker is especially racist, can you imagine that in the 1780s? They could just tell them to get lost. So who knows? Now that said, we did have the Society of Friends, which is the full term for the Quakers. They fought for emancipation from the start, from before the Revolutionary War, after the Revolutionary War. And while the main thing we've spoken about with the Quakers, besides, settling Pennsylvania, is that they were pacifists when it came to the war. That's only in regards to war. When it comes to, pushing for emancipation, they will and did throw hands. And I've got an image that I'll show you guys in just a minute. Pacifism only applies to war. That does not apply to beating the crap out of somebody. All right. So I've got this image here, the Sabbath among slaves. I imagine this is your typical propaganda of, oh, look how happy they are being enslaved. See how much better things are for them? Although there is one particular part about this image that does feel pretty real. Because on some plantations, definitely not the norm, but in some places, they would have a set of decent clothes for Sunday, because everyone was expected to look nice on Sunday, yada yada yada. But everyone's here on the Sunday best. You've got banjo playing. You got old man over here taking a nap, playing football even. And then you've got two boys over here wrestling in their good clothes. That feels very real. That's something two young boys would do, regardless of the situation. It's like, oh, you're in our good clothes. Let's make a mess. There's just some Quakers. You can tell by the hats. And here's some Quakers beating the crap out of some slave traders. They have tied them to the back of this wagon. The wagon is being slowly pulled through the town, and they're beating the shit out of them with these whipping sticks. I mean, they pull their shirts down, so this hurts. Yeah. They didn't get along with the slavers, needless to say. This is probably the most like hands-on we'll see with these guys, but there are a couple of other instances of like Quakers just straight up body blocking people while they help move enslaved people to free states. So yeah, the Quakers were good folks. All right. Speaking of people trying to gain more rights, women. Here is another common topic for the final paper for those that do the final paper. Abigail Adams. While usually it goes a little bit beyond the revolution, but that's fine because she did a lot of like post-revolutionary stuff. She's the wife of John Adams. She suggested that women be given a voice, otherwise they would need to have their own little revolution, which maybe she should have pulled the trigger on that because it took a while before women were given any kind of rights. And I've got some quotes from Abigail Adams here in just a little bit. Again, New Jersey, if you own land, you can vote. Nice little loophole there. However, when it came to how women were supposed to, on paper, shape political discourse, they were supposed to influence their husbands, sons, and brothers, and then have them go and vote. Let's see. Yeah. Actually, is that... So there was this belief that these virtuous wives and mothers were necessary for the developing nation, which leads to Benjamin Rush and his essay on female education, where says he believed that women could best shape political ideas and relations by, quote, instructing their sons in principles of liberty and government and rewarding husbands engaging in public service with, quote, approbation, I don't know what that's about, and applause. To prepare young women for this enhanced domestic role, Rush suggested educating them in literature, music, composition, geography, history, and bookkeeping. So, like, educate women more, but only so that they can prepare their sons to do politics. Yeah. Then you have Judith Sargent Murray that's like, yeah, no, screw that. Murray's suggestion was equal education for women. Because in her view, let's see, girls should be enabled to procure for themselves the necessaries of life. Independence should be placed within their grasp. She argued that by age 2, boys and girls are intellectually equal, but from then on, one is taught to aspire, the other is early confined and limited. Because, well, yeah, boys are given education and told to, succeed in the world, whereas girls are like locked in the house and told to learn to cook and clean and spin thread for years. So her argument was, and again, we'll see a quote here, basically, give them both the same education and see what happens. Like, the argument's always, oh, well, women just have a lower intellectual capacity. Cool. Give them both the same education and see if that pans out. Because if you don't give them the same education, clearly women aren't going to have the same amount of intelligence as men because they haven't had the same education. If you lock one in a closet and give the other one freaking Harvard, yeah, they're not going to have the same intellect. So yeah, regardless of how well regarded women were, um, they were given very little economic or political freedom. I mean, hell, it wasn't until like the 1970s women could open their own checking account. Like, it was real recent that women were truly, I mean, you can even argue maybe not truly, but like properly equal when it comes to economic and political stuff. And then you've somehow got people arguing today in the year 2025 that we should go back. Women don't need to vote. Their husbands can vote. And it'll all be, so why bother voting twice for the same thing? Just have the husband vote. Yeah. World we live in. Obviously, for African American and Native women, things were significantly worse. Just by exponential factors. And for Native women, actually, a lot, and again, it painting Native cultures with the broad brushes, not good. But to simplify it, there were a lot of Native cultures that were actually matriarchal, where the women were like in charge, or at the very least, men and women were just considered equal because they just did a lot of the same stuff. Or if they were separate for like hunting and gathering, the gathering typically got more food because the hunting was basically luck-based if you even found the animal you were looking for. So the hunters were coming back with like nothing, and the gatherers would have like all the roots and berries and stuff because you know where to find those. So like typically they were equal. Sometimes they were matriarchal, and sometimes like the men were in charge. But it was a lot more commonly equal than like European societies. But as the European societies came over and started like running roughshod over the native populations, and they were trying to adapt to keep up, women started losing a lot of their power as the natives started to kind of adapt to what the Europeans were doing, which is just another unfortunate cultural destruction that the Europeans brought. So here's Abigail Adams. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws which we have no voice or representation, which I, as I said, should have just done it, Abigail. Got this shit done like 200 years early. Also, this is a good example of another little thing that's not important for the test, but for future quotes like this we're going to read. You may notice that some of the capitalization in here is weird. Back then, particularly 1700s and like early 1800s, and then like just probably back to the 1500s even, ideas were considered proper nouns. Representations and idea is considered proper noun. Laws, proper noun. Rebellion. Apparently ladies was also considered an idea, I guess, in this particular statement. So that's why those are capitalized. That's just why, if you're wondering. That's just the thing they did. Especially during this period with, all the heady stuff going on during the revolution and post-revolution, and all the stuff was going on with like liberty and democracy and freedom and all this crap. There was a lot of this happening. So, yeah. Then we have Benjamin Rush. Freedom can only exist in the society of knowledge. Without learning, men are incapable of knowing their rights. And where learning is confined to a few people, liberty can neither be equal nor universal. Which is all well and good, but he's only talking about men. It's like, oh, we can't have equal liberty or universal liberty without equal learning. Cool. What about women? Like, I don't worry about that. I'm talking about men here, not humans, men. And then Judith Sargent Murray. Let me know coercion established in society and the common law of gravity prevailing, the sexes will fall into their proper places, which, to put into modern English, give everybody the same education and see what happens. Like, again, the prevailing thought was, oh, well, women can only use their brains a little bit. All right, give them the same thing and see what happens. All right. So, on to, not quite the next section. So, we were just, more issues is what we're having. My brain's trying to go. So more people were gradually being able to vote, and by more people I mean white men, typically. But as time is progressing, the interest between the rich and the poor are constantly diverging. And when disagreements would rise between the rich and poor, the authorities would typically side with the rich. Boy, that's an alien thought, isn't it? The authorities just being on the side of the people with the money. So this led, more or less, to Shays' Rebellion. 1786 is an armed uprising by indebted farmers in Massachusetts. There were various issues that led to this. That's not actually super important. But what is important is Shays' Rebellion happened, and it was put down by the militia, but it was the state militia, the local Massachusetts militia, not the federal government, because the federal government didn't have troops. They had no money to have troops. So a lot of people, in particular Washington, were like, hey, how the hell are we going to protect ourselves if we can't even, like, stop this little farmer rebellion in Massachusetts? And, like, I mean, sure, I don't remember if Philadelphia or New York was the capital this time. They kept switching back and forth. We're not in D.C. for a while. But Boston was still kind of considered the heart of this early America because that's where so much had happened. But like if you're having this farmer rebellion in Massachusetts, like what's considered essentially the heart of America, and the federal government can't do anything about it, what's stopping England from coming down from Canada and just like rolling us? So yeah, Shays' Rebellion was not the first or last of these uprisings. We would see stuff like this again. But it was troublesome because again, the federal government could do nothing about it, and the state militia had to step in. And it's seen as like a major reason for the abandonment of the Articles of Confederation and the eventual creation of the Constitution. Because the Articles of Confederation, I mean, quite specifically made it said that the central government wouldn't be very powerful because we were afraid of, England. But we were very quickly shown that having a weak central government wasn't a great idea. We needed something there. Also, we had issues on the frontier. Settlers were fighting natives, Spanish, English, all sorts of various groups along the western frontier that didn't want us there. And when they petitioned for government aid, because they were paying their taxes, and your taxes are meant to have the government help you with stuff, the government couldn't do anything. because they didn't have any troops, because they didn't have any money. So this actually, not only were people along the frontier, I forgot this is a long line in class. Sure, I got that. Bring flashbacks. Not only were they fighting Spanish, English, natives, etc. along the frontier, but like they were borderline pushing for secession already. Like, it's like, well, the government can't help us, so we're just going to make our own government. So, like, we almost lost the states west of the Appalachians, like, really early on. The early U.S. was rough. This was one of the first images I could find for Shays' Rebellion for some reason. So here's some dudes getting dunked. And then, of course, this one, when the state militia rolls in, and reminds these guys that we do still have guns, even if the federal government doesn't have any. All right. This is where I stopped for Tuesday, Thursday, but we were a little behind that day, so we can probably move on a little further, just because I don't want to have to stop in the middle of a chapter before the final. So let's just see what we can do. Let's get a little further along. So, thus begins the Philadelphia Convention of 1787. This was the start of, we got to do something about this Articles of Confederation issue. The delegates who went there were white, educated men of property, and therefore did not represent the majority of people in America. They knew their goal of revising or getting rid of the Articles of Confederation could be seen as a problem because, again, this was like the 1% changing the laws of America without anybody else's consent. So they did it in secret. Now, again, I consider this a positive thing. Not how they did it, but like getting rid of the Articles of Confederation and doing the Constitution was definitely a positive thing because it was a lot better than what the Articles were. But like, they knew with how weak the federal government was, if enough people were upset about it, they could just overturn the whole government. This is how fragile things were. So they did it in secret. Because it does look bad. So there were a couple of plans put together for how this would work. First we had the Virginia plan, which would have a stronger central government, 2 houses, although both houses would be based on state populations. So you basically would have 2 houses of representatives. I think it was, they wouldn't be like equal. There would be some difference in like how they were calculated or whatever, but that doesn't really matter. Then there was the New Jersey plan, which would have only 1 house, and then each state would have equal representation, which I think is how the Articles of Confederation work. And this would be like just the Senate, so each state would have equal representation, even if you had one state that had like 50 million people, and then you would have Montana with like 10, but you would still have the same number of delegates. And the easy way to remember this, the easy way to remember these 2 plans is Virginia was a big state. Virginia had a lot of people. New Jersey, not so much. Eventually, they did compromise into what we have today, where the Senate would have equal representation per each state, and then the House of Representatives was based on population. which I don't know, I'm still a little bit weird about. Like, I don't get why land gets representation with like the Senate, but whatever. However, they did still have to compromise to get the southern states on board because, as I mentioned, these southern states had pretty low population pretty low white populations. It was mostly like really spread out farms with mostly slaves. So they actually wouldn't have much representation in the House of Representatives. So to get them to vote on this, they created the Three-Fifths Compromise, which is awful, but here it is. Each enslaved person was counted as 3/5 of a person, so that the southern states would have a larger population count and therefore would get more representation in the House of Representatives, even though these people who were being counted, or at least partially counted, would very much not have their needs represented, but yeah. Again, slavery outlawed in Northwest Territories, but they would leave the idea of importing slaves overall alone for the next 20 years, which, again, that's not going to be an issue because England's going to solve that one for us. So here we have a bunch of old men standing around signing papers. Again, very representative of the U.S. population. And there's just the Virginia plan and New Jersey plan. This one actually has a better explanation of the Three-Fifths Compromise, where every 5 slaves would count as 3 people, as opposed to each one counting as 3/5 of a person, because that just feels like weird math. So, yeah. Right. Now, rather than like signing this into law, the Confederation Congress instead sent copies of this new Constitution out to the various state legislatures to have them approve it. So they didn't just like go in and change the government under everybody's nose, and suddenly the next day everybody wakes up and it's like, oh, by the way, we got a new government, and sucks for you guys. Now, granted, the various state legislatures did wake up to, hey, we got this thing in the mail. They want a new government, and we can sign up for it. That will be a little weird. So this led to 2 main factions appearing in the country. You have the Federalists, who supported ratification. They were largely present in large towns, considered a large central government important for the economy. They wrote the Federalist Papers. You can tell by the name. James Madison, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton. John Jay wrote like 2, and then he got real sick, so he wasn't super involved, but he was there. In Federalist Paper number 10, for example, Madison suggested big government factions would happen, but they would have to work together. So it's not like it would just be like one central power that would control everything. In a large government, you would have groups that would happen, like, I mean, what just ends up happening here anyway. Um, but in order to run the country, they'd have to work together, which, yeah, until recently, Madison, that'd be nice. And actually, in most functioning democracies, there's more than just two groups. In England, there's like 5, and in India, there's like 30. So yeah, they really have to like group together to get stuff passed, and they do because like certain groups agree on certain things against other groups. So yeah, it's having just two parties is uncommon. And then you have the Anti-Federalists, who, if you can guess from the name, didn't like the Federalists. And rather than standing for a whole bunch, they mostly stood against what the Federalists stood for. Again, you can tell by the name. Obviously, they were against ratification. They were against a strong central government. They saw it as leading to tyranny. They're often from rural, less wealthy areas. So, again, just like opposite of Federalists. Now, one thing that was important about the Anti-Federalists is their concern over the lack of a Bill of Rights. Because as we've seen with state constitutions, a lot of times they would include a Bill of Rights that would specify certain rights that weren't included in the Constitution, as like, hey, just because this wasn't specifically said, here's a list of stuff that we definitely want to have. So that does stick around. I mean, again, if you know anything about the current government, or at least how the government's supposed to work, like you can see stuff here. It's like, okay, I know, like this and this I recognize. Some of these things don't make sense because they didn't stick around. It's like, oh, Bill of Rights, that makes sense. I recognize that. So you can see where stuff got picked and pulled and used. It took a little while to actually get all these states to agree to ratify. The book actually has a little list here. The first state was Delaware in December of 1787, whereas the last state was Rhode Island in May of 1790. So yeah, it was, and Delaware was 34-0 against, whereas Rhode Island was 34-4, 32 against. So some of these were really close. Some of these were not close at all. New York and Virginia. I don't know why it says New York. New York and Virginia are not the last on the thing here, but it says that in the book for some reason. Whatever. They only agreed after the Bill of Rights was promised because they were very, into making sure that there was the Bill of Rights. And so we've got this Federalist and Anti-Federalist grouping here. The Federalists, again, in like the large population centers. So you've got the bigger population areas where the Federalists hang out, and obviously here. And then where areas are smaller, or where populations are smaller, I should say, you've got more of the Anti-Federalists. And then again, just Federalists, Hamilton, Madison, John Jay only had a few before he took ill. So Federalists supported moving powers from the states, giving it to the government, dividing powers among different branches, single person lead the executive branch, where Federalists are just not. Main with the states, legislative branch have more power, strong executive branch, the rights need to be added, yeah, all that. Then we have the 11th pillar of the great national dome, yada, yada, yada. This is this federal edifice. We were very, very up our own asses about stuff with this kind of thing. Like, oh, we got North Carolina and is that Rhode Island on the end? Yes. As these final columns are being erected to build the Constitution. All right. That'll do because I don't want to get into organizing the federal government with like 5 minutes of class left. So we will get into that next time. I mean, as exciting as talking about the Constitution is, it's kind of exciting because like it's building what we've got kind of out of nothing. Because we did almost topple a couple of times under our own weight. All right, I'll see you guys on Wednesday.